Before we get too far into cloning and templating, I want to first take a moment and step back and just explain the difference between cloning a virtual machine and templating a virtual machine, or what's the difference between a clone and a template. If we start off with a clone, you should know that a clone of a virtual machine copies that virtual machine. So you can think of it as a duplication, if you will, or a copy and paste. Now, typically, if you do just a standard clone, you clone a virtual machine into another virtual machine. However, you could also clone a virtual machine to a template or into the content library. And those are two things that we'll learn about quite a bit during this module. Now, if you clone a virtual machine to another virtual machine, that cloned virtual machine is editable and usable just like the source virtual machine was. However, with a template, on the other hand, templates are used to deploy more virtual machines. So you can think of a template as kind of your golden goose or golden image that's going to be used to base all future virtual machines on, or at least some virtual machines of a certain type. Unlike clones, templates are read-only, so you can't modify a template other than to upgrade the virtual machine. So you can't modify a template other than to upgrade the VMware tools or the virtual machine hardware. Unlike clones of virtual machines that would just be in the virtual machine inventory, templates are stored in virtual machines and templates or in the content library. We'll be learning a lot about clones and templates throughout this module, so just keep these differences in mind. Let's say that we want to take a virtual machine existing in our vSphere infrastructure and clone that virtual machine, simply creating a copy or a duplicate of that virtual machine. Again, virtual machines can be modified, whereas templates cannot. So if you wanted to create a golden image template, I would encourage you to take an existing virtual machine that you think is well created or well built, clone that virtual machine to another virtual machine so that you can make configuration changes to it, and then clone that virtual machine to a template to use as your golden image from which you'll deploy all other future similar virtual machines from. Here in the vSphere client, cloning a virtual machine is easy to do. If we go to the Windows 2019 server that we built, which is currently running as a virtual machine inside of VApp, we can right-click on this, go up to clone, and then notice here how you can either clone this to a virtual machine or you can clone it to a template. And of course, we're talking a lot about templates in this module. But for now, we're just going to clone this to a virtual machine. And that way, the virtual machine can be modified before we make it read-only by turning it into a template. And of course, you want to use your naming convention here. Let's call this web win source or SRC. This is going to be the source of our template. Now, maybe if you already have a freshly installed operating system and application and you want to use that as your source image that you create your template from, then you could really skip this step. But it's still important to understand how to clone existing virtual machines. We'll click Next. We'll run this in the prod cluster. We'll select vSAN and click Next. And then here you have the option to customize the guest operating system, customize the virtual machine hardware, or power on the virtual machine after it's created. Now we're going to turn this virtual machine into a template, but we might want to power it on and make some last minute changes. We also might want to customize the hardware of this virtual machine, the virtual hardware specifically, or even customize the guest operating system. For example, things like the virtual machine name, licensing information, and more. If you're going to do that, then you should use the guest customization wizard and create a new VM customization specification. That's where you specify how you want the new virtual machines to be created based on the golden image or template that you've selected. For example, you might want to customize things like IP address configuration, Windows licensing, domain membership, and more. In our case, we're not going to do that right now, but we will customize the virtual machine's hardware. So you can see when we clone our existing virtual machine, what we have the option to do here is to modify it or change it. So we can change the amount of virtual CPU, we can change the memory, the hard disk, the network adapter, and much more. So in our case, we've changed this to 4 vCPUs, and we're going to go ahead and remove the second hard disk. I'll click Next and Finish. Let's give this a moment to complete. And after a few moments, our clone has been created. If we go into the clone here, you can see it looks just like any other virtual machine. And if we power it on, indeed, it will be identical to our source virtual machine, WebWin1, where we installed Windows Server 2019. What we'll want to do now is to make any last-minute changes to this virtual machine before we turn it into a template, at which point it will become read-only. At this point, we cloned an existing virtual machine. We may or may not have made some changes to that cloned virtual machine, but we're going to use that as the source to create our template, which will become our golden image that we'll create more and more virtual machines from. Creating a template in vSphere is easy to do. We're going to take the virtual machine that we just cloned, I'll right-click and go up to Clone, and instead of cloning to a virtual machine, this time we will clone to a template. Of course, we'll need to give this template a name, and just like your virtual machines, I recommend you using some sort of naming convention. We'll call this WebWin Template 1. We'll store it in the Hilton Head Virtual Data Center using the production vSphere cluster and use the vSAN data store. At this point, we'll click Finish. And just like when we cloned the virtual machine, it will take a few minutes to clone this virtual machine into a template. At this point, our virtual machine has been turned into a template. You can see the task has completed. But one thing that might immediately confuse you is that it doesn't show up here in the vSphere inventory. But that's because we're on the hosts and clusters inventory. If you click over to the virtual machines and templates inventory, it's here that you'll find the new template that we just created. And you can see that this is different from a virtual machine based on the icon. The icon looks like a paper or a post-it note. And if you right click on this, you'll see this isn't like a virtual machine that can be powered on. But you can scroll down and see a little bit of information on the template, the guest operating system, the utilization on disk, and the virtual machine hardware configuration. With our template created, the next step is to deploy more virtual machines based on this template. With our template created, the proverbial golden image, we can now use that golden image, that template, to create new virtual machines. Here in the vSphere client, in the virtual machine and template inventory, we have our new template created. All I have to do is right-click and select New Virtual Machine from this template. And that'll bring up the new virtual machine wizard. Of course, another way to access this, if you're in the hosts and clusters inventory, if you right-click here and select to create a new virtual machine, you can choose to deploy a new virtual machine from template here as well. The first step is to select the source of the template. We don't have a content library created yet, but that's something we'll be doing later in this module. In our case, we'll select the data center. We'll scroll down and we'll find the template that we created, WebWin Template 1. I'll click Next. And then, of course, we need to give this virtual machine a name. So we'll call this WebWin-2, sticking with our naming convention for virtual machines. I'll click Next. We'll choose to deploy it to the prod cluster. And again, we'll store it on VMware vSAN. And at this point, we can choose to customize the operating system. Of course, being as this is a Windows machine, you do want to make sure that you don't have duplicate computer names. And of course, if this Windows virtual machine is not part of a domain, you want to make sure that it doesn't have a duplicate GUID. which is the Windows Globally Unique Identifier. You also might want to customize the virtual machine hardware. And of course, you could easily just power on the virtual machine after it's created. I'll click Next and Finish. You can see our new virtual machine is immediately created. If we check the status of it, it will take a minute to clone from the template to the new virtual machine. Let's give this a moment to complete, and then we'll check the status. With the cloning from template process completed and the virtual machine automatically powered on, we can scroll down and take a look at this VM. It does have the same Windows guest operating system that we had in our template. And here we have a brand new virtual machine deployed based on the template that we created. So that's how easy it is to deploy new virtual machines based on existing templates in VMware vSphere. Before we create our first vApp, I want to take a quick detour here and show you something that I think is really cool, and that is that you can download virtual appliances from the VMware Marketplace. You'll find it at marketplace.cloud.vmware.com. This was previously called the VMware Solutions Exchange, and it's here that you can download not just VMware virtual appliances, but also management packs and a number of other tools and products that integrate with VMware vSphere, vCloud Director, VMware Cloud on AWS, and the new VMware Tanzu Kubernetes. In our case, we're going to select on-prem solutions. And if we scroll down the list here, you can see there are a wide variety of solutions available for download as virtual appliances. Things like load balancers, firewalls, data protection, performance analyzers. And what I find to be really cool are these virtual appliances with the operating system and applications already installed, such as WordPress, Zookeeper, Tomcat, and much more. And outside of the VMware Virtual Appliance Marketplace, of course, you can download VMware products in virtual appliance format from VMware.com. If we go here to Downloads, for example, and into vSphere, scrolling on down, you can find a wide variety of VMware products here, most of them in virtual appliance format, including things like VMware NSX, vSphere Replication, and of course, what we're going to deploy, which is vRealize Operations. And you can see here that vRealize Operations Manager is an appliance install. That's a virtual appliance with operating system and application already installed. It's a 2.7 gigabyte OVA file, which is the Open Virtualization Appliance format. And I can tell you, I've already downloaded this. And while this course isn't on installing vRealize Operations Manager, it is about virtual appliances and vApps. So here in the vSphere client, if we right-click on our production cluster and say Deploy OVF Template, we can select a local file that we want to upload. And in our case, it's on the desktop. And I'll select vRealize Operations Manager version 8.2. It is in the OVA format. This is the virtual appliance that I've just downloaded from VMware.com. And if I click through, taking all the defaults, you can see it recognizes this as the vRealize Operations Manager virtual appliance running on Photon OS with vRealize Operations Manager already installed. I'm not going to have to install an operating system or an application. I can select where I want this deployed, click Next, Next, fill out some basic information here on networking, click Next, and we can deploy this virtual appliance by clicking Finish. Of course, it takes a few minutes to import the virtual appliance and perform the deployment, but that's far faster than creating a virtual machine, installing an operating system, and installing an application. Virtual appliances make deployment and sharing of applications so much easier.